Welcome back to the Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse. Before I get into the episode, Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. From the preseason NFL to college kicking off, Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while games are being played. Think you know your stuff. Head in on our winner take all 300,000 NFL survivor pool for the upcoming season. When the game's over, head on over to the online casino, get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with over 150 slot games. Head to the website today and use promo code BELIEVE to get in on the action. Bet online, the game starts here. All right. So a lot has happened over the last few days. The Orioles were able to split a series against the Boston Red Sox. Jackson Holliday had a big four-hit game, had his first triple of his major league career. So that was a big deal. And Albert Suarez continued to dominate as a starting pitcher for the Orioles since his return to the rotation, and he's looked great and fantastic. And last but not least, of course, there's other stuff, but the last thing I'm going to say here is that Cade Povich had a really, really nice start against the Red Sox, where he ended up being the losing pitcher because Yennier Cano came in and allowed an inherited runner that Povich had put on base to score, and he ended up taking a really difficult loss, but had a no hitter through I think 5 innings, and did a really really great job in his first start back to the major leagues and his first start back in the rotation in his return to Baltimore. So um, there has been a lot of really encouraging stuff with all that. Some good news that's come out from the Orioles overall. Uh, but I'm going to talk about today a situation regarding the back end of the bullpen and who the closer is going to be moving forward for the Orioles. So this conversation has been necessitated, of course, from the recent struggles of Craig Kimbrell. I'm sure he is on a spiritual journey at this point, trying to rediscover himself and re-find out who he is as a pitcher. But in the meantime, it's been a real struggle for him. But the Orioles have found at least a short-term replacement in Sir Anthony Dominguez, who's done a good job the last few games, who's come on, who's gotten consistent saves since his time on the Orioles. He's done a really, really good job for the team. So I'm basically just going to talk a bit about like I'm gonna go through a few closing options for the Orioles, who potentially could do it, and then I'm gonna sort of get into the conversation between Dominguez and Kimbrel. And is Dominguez the permanent closer from now on? Does Kimbrel have a decent chance to return to being a closer for the Orioles this year? And then also more importantly, potentially, like what does this look like? What does the closing situation look like for the Orioles as we enter the playoffs? So I'm going to get into all that. So when thinking about it, I think it's fair to say the Orioles have more or less four realistic closing options on this team. Um, I would say at the current moment, three realistic closing options. But the first one that I'm just going to throw out there uh, is Gregory Soto being a closing option. Now, he's been a closer in the past. Unfortunately, right now, I think as everybody who is listening is aware, he's been nothing short of a wreck since coming to the Orioles. He has 15 plus ERA since coming to the Orioles. Now, a lot of that is informed by really, really uh, bad, but also a little bit unfortunate performance he had since yeah, getting to the Orioles. But overall, Soto is a bit of a mess right now. His command is all over the place, which is, to some extent what you would expect from a lefty that has thrown 100 miles an hour, and he's just all over the place right now. His command is wild. I think Adley Rutschman has two pass balls this year. This is kind of a funny stat that speaks to a bit about Gregory Soto, but uh, Adley Rutschman has two pass balls this year, and they're both to Gregory Soto. Now, granted, those aren't wild pitches, so they're not. I guess yeah, they're not wild pitches in the sense that his command was so horrendous that although I'm sure Soto has his fair share of wild pitches since being on the Orioles, but more just that like the velocity, the movement, and sort of even if it's inside, if even if it's in the zone or it's in catching range for Adley Rutschman, just the difficulty with the velocity, the command, the movement, in being able to predict and expect where it's going to go. So it's kind of a funny stat. But yeah, so right now, as far as like the Orioles and Gregory Soto, if Craig Kimbrell, I'm sorry, if Felix Bautista was not coming back to the back end of the bullpen to take over his closing duties, if let's say he was out for another year next year, I would say that Gregory Soto could potentially, if he figured things out in the offseason, potentially be in the mix for a closing role for the Orioles next year. But at this current time, especially with how he's looked, that's especially off the table. Now, uh, we still do have a month and a half or so, a little less than a month and a half or so before the playoffs begin. Now, I do think, of course, that I do not expect to see Gregory Soto in any way, shape, or form be on the mound in a save situation closing for the Baltimore Orioles. But what I will say is if Brandon Hyde were to put him on the mound in a save situation, okay, even in a 3-run game with Soto, I would still apply this to, but of course, it's scarier and riskier if it's a 1-run game. But if Brandon Hyde were to put Gregory Soto on the mound to try to close out a playoff game for the Baltimore Orioles, I would call him, without a doubt, the most courageous manager baseball has ever seen. Because in a situation like that, if things go wrong and he implodes, everybody's going to be like, that was literally the dumbest thing you could have ever done. But if Brandon Hyde, and again, I want to confirm that I don't expect him to do this, but if he were to put Gregory Soto on the mound, I would just give him the most courageous manager of lifetime, like a record that could not be broken by any future manager, anything like that, because that would be amazing to be able to do. And if it worked, arguably you could say one of the smartest managers of all time. Of course, if it didn't work, you would just say, yeah, that was really dumb and stupid, and you know, there'd be a lot of anger, and potentially something like that could be a career or a job losing move for Brandon Hyde if it were not to work out. So, in any case, uh, not yeah. So I'm sort of casting a little bit of a wide net. Maybe I could cast a wider net when thinking about closing options for the Orioles. But I did just want to say Soto because he does have the stuff for it. He does have the closing experience for it. But right now he's so much of a disaster. And the Orioles have him next year, so that's a positive sign. And hopefully they can work with him in the offseason and try to unravel any issues that exist with him. But as far as closing this year for the Orioles, I don't see that really as a possibility happening without like dramatic improvement. Which even if he did have that dramatic improvement, I wouldn't still be surprised if maybe he would come in more high leverage situations, but it would also require the other back end guys to be an absolute disaster as well in conjunction with him doing really well. So just like the tables flipping in a way that I just don't expect. So yeah, and then even if he were to be the closer, I think every Oriole fan would have a real heart attack every time, including, of course, including Brandon Hyde would have a real heart attack every time he entered the mound. But again, just because of where he's at, everything, I'm just casting a wide net here. But yeah, Gregory Soto, I don't expect to close any of the games for the Orioles this year. Um, so who's been used definitely is Sir Anthony Dominguez. But I just did want to talk quickly about Yennier Cano and the possibility of him being a closer. Now, the thing with Cano, so he does have a bit of closing experience for the Orioles in the past. Okay, so this is true. And there are some things about Cano that are favorable to him being a closer. The big knock against him, and it's not even a huge knock, but the big thing that why you would not want him to be the closer for the Orioles is because he doesn't have a giant K percentage. So he strikes out just a bit less than 1K per inning. I think it's about 8.8 Ks per nine. So and most closers are more than that. Most closers are more than a K per nine, if not 10 or 11 per nine, and sometimes with certain guys even more than that, right? So the one thing you look at with him and the closing situation is just sort of that he is a guy that doesn't strike out a lot of guys. He's not overpowering, he's not dominant. Um Now Yennier Cano is in the 99th percentile of ground ball percentage, which this is going to be a stat that I come back to with the next two guys that I talk about. But Yennier Cano is a master of the ground ball, 99th percentile of ground ball percentage. He's incredible with this. And when you're a closer and you don't strike guys out, the one possibility sort of that could end up happening is there a team could string a couple hits together, a few ground balls, find holes, and that could kind of be a problem. And it's more of a problem when you don't have that firepower in terms of strikeout ability. Now he has it a little bit, but there are other guys in the league that are closer to being able to sort of get a strikeout on command, and Cano isn't really like that. So if he's in a jam, he can't really like uh go for a strikeout in a way that sort of other closers have the ability to. So the other thing about the ground ball percentage is the thing about this is it now his ground ball percentage is overall really, really good. Now I was giving it in that particular context because that's like where a situation could erupt where you give up a string of hits and then you don't have the strikeout ability there to the same extent other guys do to sort of get out of a potential jam, right? Now, if you have that strikeout ability, that's a really good combination. The thing about this ground ball percentage, though, is when you relegate him, and in this case, I will say relegate him as if it's like a negative thing being the closer. But when you relegate him to the closer role, you also don't have him available in those vital middle innings where maybe the starting pitcher gave up a couple hits in a row. Their runners on first and second with one out. And Yennier Cano in a situation like that is the perfect guy to come to then roll a ground ball double play, right? So when you if Cano were put in the closer role, he can't be available to come get the Orioles out of jams in this way that can be really important and really useful for the Orioles in the middle innings. So normally when you're the closer, you're either getting the last out of the eighth inning but normally you're coming on to start the ninth inning, and there's no ground ball double play situation in the ninth inning. And that ground ball double play situation that you could have needed Cano was in the seventh, but you didn't use them then because you were holding on to him for the ninth. So that's sort of why Cano is not like the ideal closer for the Orioles. Now, I definitely think Cano would be serviceable in the closer role, but uh, it's just a little bit of a mismatch in skills and abilities, and where the best place for you is in the bullpen as far as Cano. So, again, I think he'd be serviceable, but that's why I think there's been reluctance in large part to have him sort of be closing games for the Orioles. Now, looking at Sir Anthony Dominguez, so yeah, basically he's done a really, really good job since coming to the O's. Since he's been on the O's, he has posted a 174 ERA. He's given up two earned runs, and he's given up five hits and just three walks. So, and that's over 10 and oh my gosh, I'm looking for it. It's over 10 and a third inning. I was going to say 10 and two thirds. So I'm glad I double checked that. So yeah, basically what the hits and the walks amounts to is a 0.774 ERA. Now this is again just looking at since he's come to the Orioles. So a 0.774 ERA, of course, is elite. When he was on the Phillies prior to coming to the Orioles, his whip was 122, so it's the whip is going to be in the middle of that, probably. 122 is um yeah, it's probably I mean, even 122 is probably around where we might expect Dominguez. Give or take a little bit. I think it might be slightly high relative to like what we would normally hope for or whatever. He's had years in the past where he's been above that. He's had years in the past where he's been below that. But somewhere in that range, 122 is not like he was for the Phillies is not unheard of. But since he's come to the Orioles, he's had a really, really excellent whip. Now the thing about Dominguez, um, when thinking about him for the closer role, so there are some positive things. So the K percentage, he's in the 80th percentile for K percentage. So for a closer, that's really, really good. His average velocity for both his four seam and his sinker is 98 miles an hour, which is also excellent for a closer. Um, and yeah, the last he now has amassed four saves for the Baltimore Orioles. And he's had really very little signs of blemishes. Yesterday, on Sunday against the Red Sox, he did give up a meaningless solo home run in the ninth inning. Not worried about that at all. Um, but this is one thing. This that home run he gave up is sort of indicative of something that is not ideal at a bare minimum out of the closer position. Sir Anthony Dominguez has is in the 14th percentile for ground ball percentage. So this is yeah, and it's at 36%. So this is really not good because he's overall a fly ball pitcher for yeah, he's overall a fly ball pitcher, and for a closer when you're coming into a game with a one-run lead, especially when it's a situation where the heart of the opposing team's lineup is coming up, something like this, some of those fly balls might end up turning into home runs, right? And that's kind of concerning, especially when you have a one run lead. Now, I, you know, how I might have said things, it might feel like I'm saying a contradiction because what I was saying prior for Cano was that, well, he gives up so many ground balls and, a few sneak through, and then you sort of have a situation where he doesn't have the ability to get the strikeout. So with Cano, the ground ball percentage was the high ground ball percentage. It might have sounded like I was using as a negative for why he should not be the closer. But that's really not it. It's about the ground ball percentage in conjunction with the strikeout percentage. So I overall like ground ball percentages is really really good for pitchers and particularly for closers. Now, if you look at someone like Emmanuel Clase, his ground ball percentage is through the roof. He's like elite. I think he's in the 98th or 99th percentile for ground ball percentage. So ground balls from closers are good. So yeah, I was just sort of outlining a scenario where without the strikeout being available as much as an option for Cano, that's how sometimes you can run into trouble. Um, but if yeah, you sort of if you're getting ground balls and you're not giving up a lot of fly balls, then you sort of eliminate one of the avenues for the opposing team to potentially score. Now, in Dominguez's case, one of the things going against him is this ground ball percentage. He can be a little home run prone. So that's not ideal, but the Orioles are not in a situation where we can have the perfect closer at this point. If we had Felix Bautista back, we would have something resembling the perfect closer. But the Orioles are not in that situation. We were not in that situation when we signed Craig Kimbrell at the beginning of the year. We all knew that there was risk involved. I don't think anybody thought, okay, we just completely resolved our closer situation, not to ever have to be revisited again for this entire year, right? That was not the situation the Orioles were doing. When that was not the situation when the Orioles signed Craig Kimbrell, right? Um, so the thing though about Dominguez's ground ball percentage is that it is low. However, if you compare it to Craig Kimbrell's ground ball percentage, Kimbrell is in the third percentile of ground balls. So yeah, at 30%, 30.5%. So that is even worse than Dominguez. So the big knock against Dominguez being a potential closer is potentially allowing the home run, allowing fly balls that could turn into home runs. But if we're comparing Dominguez to Kimbrel, that can't even be used as a knock against him because Kimbrel is the one who is more likely to be hurt by the home run or by fly balls. I actually don't have, let's see. So I guess yeah, just looking at the exact home run numbers. So this year, Kimbrel has given up 6 home runs, and between the two teams, Sir Anthony Dominguez has given up 8 home runs. Okay, so they're like somewhat comparable. And that actually uh potentially slightly undermines the point I'm making a little bit here. But overall, you want in a closer, you want somebody that is generally throwing ground balls. And I would say 10 and 8 are comparable. And especially if you look at this new Sir Anthony Dominguez that we've been experiencing so far since he's come to the Orioles, yeah, things have been good. Although, yeah, both of his home runs have been I'm sorry, both of the runs that he has allowed have been on solo home runs. So but overall, if you're looking at the metric, I'm not more concerned about Sir Anthony Dominguez giving up home runs than I am Craig Kimbrell giving up home runs. So that's the one thing that I think like last year for um last year for the Phillies, uh Dominguez gave up 7 home runs over the course of the entire year. And the year before that he gave up 4. And for Kimbrel, I'm sure it was, yeah, he gave up 10 in 2023, and 4 the year before that. So, right, that sort of balances out what I'm saying a little bit. So, the point, yeah, just the overall point is that, if we're worried about anybody giving up the fly ball and the damage that the fly ball could do for the against us, I'd be more worried about that concern from Kimbrel than from Dominguez. Now, I think it would be ideal in either of these situations for, either of them to be coming into a game with a 2 or you know, ideally a 3, but a 2-run lead even, so that just the 1 home run can't blow the game for us, right? But that's not always going to be the situation. So basically, those are sort of the dimensions to each of their games. The K percentage for Kimbrel is definitely higher than it is. Kimbrel is in the 96th percentile for K percentage, where Dominguez is in the 80th percentile. So that does work to Kimbrel's advantage. Now, the big problem, of course, with Kimbrel at this moment is just a question of, well, can Kimbrel be effective? What are the odds that Kimbrel is able to figure things out before the postseason? Or are we going to be utilizing Sir Anthony Dominguez moving forward for the rest of the season and headed into the playoffs? Now, to answer this, I will say I do think the Orioles are going to put a lot of emphasis and a lot of importance on trying to get Craig Kimbrel to return to his regular form. Now, whether that can happen is a little bit of a mystery. Anecdotally, it did happen earlier in the year when Craig Kimbrel really had a rough stretch, but then was able to turn it around. So he's in the midst of another really rough stretch. Maybe he can turn it around. His playoff performance, though, I think is looming in the back of Brandon Hyde's and I think all Oriole fans' minds headed into the playoffs. And it does become a question, what is the risk and the potential reward for each of these guys to potentially be the closer. Now, Dominguez has done so well since coming to the Orioles, that I think that it is at this point his job to lose. Now, I do think, like I said, the Orioles are going to be trying to get Kimbrel to a place where he can be a back end of the bullpen guy. I do think when we do get to the playoffs, Hyde is going to sort of have one of the guys in mind for, I'm going to him to close this game. I don't think when it gets to the playoffs, we're going to be as willing to do a closer by committee situation. I think it's going to be everybody, Hyde is going to want to put everybody firmly into their roles, have the expectations clearly laid out to alleviate as much as he can any mental stress that the Orioles and the players are enduring during that time. So I think that it's going to be a situation where Hyde is going to try to be very, very clear. And at that point in time, he's going to be likely selecting either Kimbrel or Dominguez to be the closer moving forward. Now, as I said, I do think it is at this point Dominguez is to lose. I think he does have to have a really, really rough stretch here in order for Hyde to sort of sound the alarm and to try to make a move back to the potentially risky uh, Craig Kimbrel, right? I mean, we are, I was joking earlier about him putting Soto in to close a playoff game. And I think that even though it's not the same, it's certainly not the same. But putting Craig Kimbrel would be a lighter version of putting in Soto in terms of like that heart attack factor, that worry factor, etc. So now, you know, if Dominguez happens to blow two saves in a row or three saves in a row, and Kimbrel is pitching pretty well, maybe in the midst of the postseason, if that doesn't ruin the Orioles' chances completely, maybe a change would be made if it had to be made. That has happened in the postseason before, where a certain closer is not cutting it, and a manager mid playoffs will change who the closer is. Right? That's sort of like a worst case scenario, like by necessity type situation. Like we have to avoid this guy closing. Right? I don't think that's likely to happen. Even if Dominguez were to blow one, I don't think he'd blow multiple. I mean, anything can happen, of course, and he could hit a really rough stretch here where he just implodes going through the rest of the season, and Kimbrel is the closer headed into the playoffs. But I do think that it is likely to be Dominguez moving forward, and then I think steadily we're trying to put Kimbrel into more high leverage situations. That hasn't gone great so far, as we saw with the Rays, where he had to take the loss. That hasn't been going great, but I think Hyde is trying to reintegrate Kimbrel into more high leverage uh, situations that resemble closing situations. And I think that the plan, at least as of now, barring any dramatic changes, is for Kimbrel to be a back end of the bullpen guy, and then to have Dominguez be slamming the door shut and closing the game. Now, again, uh, if Kimbrel shows marked improvement, even if he does show this improvement and he sort of works himself out, that's sort of where a little bit more the question becomes, well, who are we going to go to, right? Um, but I do think that uh, in order for Kimbrel to be named the playoff closer by the end of the year, I do think that we would have to see Dominguez flounder in his role as the closer in a way that we have not yet seen. So I think yeah, as I said, I do think it is Dominguez's to lose. And I do think he is going to be our closer by the time we hit the playoffs. If I had to, I want to make clear I never bet, I never gamble, but if I had to bet, I would bet that it will be Dominguez that's going to be our closer headed into the playoffs. And hopefully if Kimbrel works himself into a better situation, he can be a back end of the bullpen guy. Worst case situation, he'll probably be on the team for the playoffs, but will be like a middle reliever, right? Uh, which would be really, really unfortunate because I think the Orioles would greatly, greatly benefit from having him be a back end of the bullpen piece. But if Dominguez is forced into the closer role, then that puts a lot of pressure on. Okay, well now we sort of need Cano to be the eighth inning guy. Danny Coulomb is coming back, but he's sort of a mix and match guy. You're not like gonna probably throw Coulomb uh, every single eighth inning and just rely and expect him to work the eighth, right? So it sort of does put a lot of pressure if Kimbrel isn't able to figure things out. But I do think that barring some dramatic changes, and I do think they would have to be dramatic changes from what we're seeing right now. I do think it'll be Dominguez closing for us the rest of the way and headed into the playoffs. I wouldn't be surprised if Hyde puts Kimbrel in to a few save situations toward the end of this year, potentially in a multi-run lead where he can be removed if necessary. But uh I do think that ultimately, like heading into the playoffs, when we get to the playoffs, it'll be Dominguez that is on the mound closing out the games for us. So, all right. Thank you so much for listening. The Orioles are in New York for a 3-game set against the Mets. So, yeah, that's kind of exciting for me, even though it makes it Well, in some ways, it makes it easier to go watch because I might be able to go to one of the games. But in some ways, it also makes it more difficult to watch due to local blackout, etc. But in any case, yeah, the O's play three against the Mets. At this point in the season, every game is a big game. The Orioles, right now, as of this moment, are tied with the Yankees atop the division of the AL East with identical records. So every game is a big game. Every game is a big game. So thank you so much for listening. Feel free to follow the show, give us a 5-star rating and a review. Please subscribe to us on YouTube if you have any thoughts. Please comment on the show. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email the show, thewarehousepod@gmail.com. Feel free to follow us on Instagram and on Twitter at The Warehouse Pod. Thanks to the sponsor of this episode. This has been The Warehouse Podcast. My name is Jesse, and go O's.